All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, thanks so much for joining us for this session of Max Minutes. Want to say a special thank you to our anchor investors. These organizations support Max and are integral into our success. So if you see these organizations, please thank them for their investment in workforce development in Metro Atlanta. My name is Daniela Perry. I am the Vice President of the Georgia Chamber Foundation for the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and serve on the MAX Executive Committee with Tim. And so we are really excited to talk through all things 2024 legislative session. It's here, whether we like it or not. And so we're going to bring some fun tidbits and harsh realities to get us started. We have Tim Cairl from the Metro Atlanta Chamber, and then my dear friend and colleague Cosby Johnson from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce to chat through. And so I will stop sharing my screen, and Tim, would love for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your role at the Metro Atlanta Chamber.
Thanks, Daniela. Hey, everybody. Tim Cairl. Good to be with you all again. Um, like Danielle said, I'm Senior Director at the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I handle all things education and workforce related to policies and programs. Um, yeah, for our legislative agenda, and did you want me to jump into that, Daniela? I'm happy to. Um, I thought maybe what I would do from the beginning before I jump into that is maybe just share a little bit about the General Assembly and sort of give everybody a snapshot before we jump in. Um, but before I do that, Cosby, do you want to do your intro before I like steal any of the thunder?
No, listen, Tim, you're the perfect person to go forward and steal all the thunder. Cosby Johnson from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. Happy to be with you all. And as Tim moves through kind of the priorities that I'm sure a lot of them we share, I will just tie in some context about the overall political atmosphere as a whole, and a couple things the Georgia Chamber may be working on as well. So happy to follow you up, Tim.
Thanks. So pardon me while I'm going to share the screen. I don't like to just have my face like talking at you, so I prepared a slide. So this one, I just want to do a little bit of stage setting for you. Just as a reminder, we are on a 2-year session cycle, which means that our legislative sessions run over the course of 2 full years. So anything that starts in an odd numbered year does technically carry over to an even year unless it's been voted up or down or vetoed. We are in between those 2-year sessions. We have 56 members of the Senate, and that is split 33 Republican, 23 Democrat. And then on the House side, we have 180 state representatives with 102 Republicans and 78 Democrats. I hope I've gotten that number right. It has moved a little bit. The Senate is presided over by Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and the House is presided over by the Speaker, who is John Burns. Just as an interesting tidbit, this last year in 2023 was the first year, and I forget the number of decades. It's been a long, long time since we have had a brand new Lieutenant Governor at the same time as a brand new Speaker of the House. As you can imagine, when you have these two positions that handle a lot of legislation, it takes a little while for communication and for staff, working together and all of those things to get ironed out. But I would say, that kind of started to smooth over pretty quickly. So I just wanted to level set there. And then just as a reminder, our statewide constitutional offices, so our governor, attorney general, secretary of state, all the way down for those state offices that are elected every 4 years, are held by Republican members, and the 2 chambers are controlled by the Republican Party. That's just to level set, particularly for those who may be imports from other states at some point. So just wanted to share that and level set before I jump into kind of what the Metro Chamber is working on for this year. So our priorities haven't changed a whole lot for legislative agenda. We have 3 main agendas that are primarily around funding. One is childcare. We're really trying to support the early education system for our infant and toddlers, those 0 to 3, and then the pre-K system, mostly 4 and 5-year-olds. Very important, not just from a community standpoint, but also from a workforce standpoint. And then we also have been very involved, along with the Georgia Chamber and a number of other folks, with computer science education for K-12, and making sure that that system and that program of support for our teachers is very well funded and expanding. We still have a lot more work to do there, but it's been encouraging to see that roll out pretty heavily since 2019 when that was put into place. And then the last one is around post-secondary entry and completion. We've been involved with a number of folks, I'm sure, on this call with the college completion grants, which were a great and welcome addition to our policy agenda a few years ago. And Representative Chuck Martin on the House side has been leading the charge on that, along with some of his partners in the Senate. So that system, while not a complete needs-based or income-based effort, certainly is miles ahead of where we were years ago, and is modeled after the Panther Grant at Georgia State and a number of other institutions. So we are very excited to see that happen. It's a financial assistance grant that kicks in towards the end of a student's college journey, when they have those financial hiccups that may get into place. So those are the three main ones, and a lot of other smaller ones I could go into, but I'll stop there, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Tim, for providing that context. I think it's super important. We know kind of all those things, especially going into an election year. It's just all going to be a little bit more fun. And then thank you too for sharing priorities. Cosby, I know we have a lot of similarities with the Metro Atlanta Chamber and really work well together. It's part of the big chamber family, but we'd love to pass it to you to highlight anything that kind of fits too with stuff that the Georgia Chamber is going to focus on for K-12 and workforce.
Yeah, I think number one, Tim, you hit the home run, because you named most of the things that we work on together, and there was no better person to explain it. I want to just add a little context of what the Georgia Chamber has been hearing as we've been on the road. I know everyone, if you haven't, let us know, and we'll point you in the good direction of when our CEO is in your region or in your area. When he's been on the road, he's been talking about really the graying and the transitioning of our workforce. And during that transition of the workforce, we have to be focused on truly how we develop the talent for the next generation. And that's really ensuring that we are removing the hurdles from people completing their education in all spaces. And what we've heard is, while there's been a consistent focus on kind of the base 4-year education, how people complete technical school, and how people come through those systems and get right into the workforce, they wanted to put some force behind. So when you talk about what Tim talked about at the end there is something that we are deeply focused on when we're talking about those college completion grants. The second piece that I want to talk about is something that I think just affects the whole. When you talk about the political climate, Daniela touched a little bit on the fact that it's going to be an election year, which I think has us more in a posture where we are going to be defending some of the tax credits that strengthen our economy, but also ensuring that really kind of some of those bad legislative bills don't get across the line. And in doing that, it's fair to talk about the fact that we have had some shifting maps, and those maps continue to shift, which is something that throws a lot of, I don't want to say just educational paths for different regions, but also who you're working with as far as your leaders. And we've seen those lines shift in places not only in the Atlanta metro region, but also in places like Middle Georgia, where Macon is getting a new state house seat, and what those lines look like. So at the Georgia Chamber, we've been deeply focused, not our hands on it, but just ensuring that regional partners have access to new leaders, to changing leaders, but also understanding the changing dynamic down at the Capitol. And so outside of jumping into the tons of tax credits and other things that we've been defending, Danielle, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Cosby. So, and I really appreciate you kind of talking about all of that. And for those that don't know too, Cosby actually serves as the mayor of Brunswick. So if you've got any coastal questions, make sure you give them all to Cosby. He has all the answers and solutions.
Please. And if you're down there, come visit, come hang out with us.
And spend all of your money in Brunswick, all of it.
Exactly.
But so number of study committees met this year. I think it was probably, I mean, it felt like a record. I think all of us were on the road with at least 12 of them on any given day, and then missed the other 14. I served on the state Senate study committee for expanding Georgia workforce along with Dave from y'all's team, Tim. But any big takeaways from all of those different study committees? And there were also, standing committees that subcommittees worked with. I know from Chuck Martin's group on the House Higher Education, but would love to know y'all's top takeaways from any of those groups that met on the House and Senate side.
Yeah, I think for me, it was just an indication of maybe where they're headed for upcoming legislative issues. There have been a lot of study committees around certificate of need on the healthcare side. You mentioned the expanding Georgia's workforce, and there's just been some increased attention, not just to workforce through the standing committees you mentioned, but also on the early education sides. Pro Tem Speaker Jan Jones did the early learning study committee around that. So it's going to be interesting to see where those legislative agendas lie. If you don't know, most of those committees produce reports. Some of them have specific legislative action that they're calling for, and some of them are a little more about concentration and where the state should focus priorities. But those reports that indicate very specific legislation are going to be really good. There was a study committee on dual enrollment as well that had some very specific legislative action pieces in it. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that and see what direction those pieces take and what legislation or budget items come out of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if you're looking for some of these, if you go on the Georgia General Assembly's website and go under study committees, it'll kind of say like final report, and you can click on it and work through. I know one we tracked to a lot was occupational licensing reform that was in the Senate with Chairman Larry Walker. They've released some recommendations as well. Of course, we've got, Raffensperger's Georgia Works Commission. And so all the things, but Cosby too, would love your thoughts. I know you attended a bunch of these too on behalf of the chamber. Any big takeaways of what we can expect or things that you continue to hear about from legislators they're interested in pursuing?
Two things. I think Tim really brought up a good point, because he wrapped in one that maybe we're not thinking about directly in the workforce, but you got to think about it as far as building out your communities and building a workforce in your specific area. When you talk about the conversation around certificate of need, which I know the Georgia Chamber is neutral on, will remain neutral, but that's a real conversation for local communities that not only affects the healthcare, but also affects the ability to attract workers, attract people back to your area who want to live, work, and play. Another one that I think is, connected in a way by sinews, right, is the work that we've been doing around some of the tax credit work. There has been a call for tax credits to be evaluated across the board. I know the Georgia Chamber is okay with evaluation, but it's how you evaluate those tax credits in the secondary and tertiary markets that they touch as well, and how those are wrapped into the complete picture. We've seen them kind of start to look at a few individual tax credits that we think that they have their eye on as far as changing, and it'll be important for us to defend those tax credits and really show how it's building out industries throughout Georgia. And one of them to speak to is the film tax credit. The film tax credit has not only grown jobs here in Georgia, but has grown really other markets outside of the main Atlanta market. I know Columbus has a studio. And so when you talk about something that is far-reaching as the billions of dollars that impact our state, it's going to be really important as we think about workforce and the jobs of tomorrow, ensuring that we protect those industries that are creating those jobs that our children will be walking into. The last one I really want to touch on is Daniela, what you said right there at the end, which was the occupational licensing. It was great to go to a couple of those, but it was really great to sit in with Secretary of State Raffensperger as he really talked about how to have a real conversation with modernizing the boards that lie under him, his occupational boards, and ensuring that they're getting their licensing right. I know, Daniela, you've been a major voice in that discussion, and we were blessed to have you at the table. So I was just sitting in as a substitute. But it's going to be important for us to continue to do the work that really Daniela's father started with licensure reciprocity, ensuring that we build out licensure reciprocity in specific spaces, especially for our military families as they move and transition here in the state. So we were happy to be a part of that, and we'll continue to keep our ear to the ground as legislation moves through.
Thanks, Cosby. And I think great point on the industry side. We know the film industry has been huge. We know too the impact in Metro Atlanta in terms of job growth and what this has done. There was also a study committee on truck driver shortages too. I know supply chain is huge. Metro Atlanta has really grown our warehousing distribution as we continue to be a huge hub. Port of Savannah and Brunswick have done so much to bring more goods into the state. So those are some key industries too. If you're not healthcare, of course, we need more registered nurses, a year ago, 12 days ago, all the things. So key things to watch too, as we're thinking about that, which is a good segue into the fact that we've talked about, this is the second year of the biennium. So Tim, you mentioned that things that were alive last year are currently, unless they were vetoed or passed or failed, they're all still alive. I know there was one bill that I think we worked on too, and Tim, I know y'all were supportive too. I think you were about the licensing bill for those that previously have a criminal background, and it is just waiting for a final conference committee, but huge, again, to provide some predictability for those that do have a criminal background that want to go into licensing. There's a lot of barriers. I believe Wade Askew from Georgia Justice Project has presented on a Max Minutes before about all this, but what would y'all want to flag for us that is alive from last year that you're watching this year, whether it's good or bad, or you're just kind of making sure it doesn't go too far? But Tim, we'll start with you.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, to be honest, and that's not unusual in between session years. We've got everything, on the workforce education side. We had an initiative around teleconferencing for workforce boards and making that available. It's kind of one of those sad but yet slightly funny things that was left over from 2020, where we allowed a lot of state functions that meet not just workforce boards, but a number of agency boards and things that we gave a lot of flexibility to add teleconferencing or video conferencing in for those workforce boards. So if you're on like a local school governing board, like all of those things have mostly switched to somewhat virtual, but for some reason our workforce boards just didn't get included in that legislation several years ago. So we've been at it to get that added. You mentioned a lot of things around second chances and record restriction. Those are still technically alive. So I should also mention too, for those on the call, that you kind of have two options with these things. You can continue with the original bill, but if there were fixes or additions or maybe new sponsors for the bill, a lot of times these things will take the form of a new piece of legislation that will get dropped, usually at the beginning of session if they're going to do that. So you've got kind of two options: carrying on with the old bill or creating the new one. The school choice legislation isn't necessarily a leftover, but it's likely to be considered one of those leftover options, as is truck weights. Both of those options were really big during the final days of the 2023 General Assembly. And then you also mentioned earlier about certificate of need. A lot of those healthcare and mental health initiatives that were started last year, all technically still carrying on there. So these are all things that we're not only invested quite heavily in a few of these things, but they are likely to, in lobbyist speak, they're likely to take the oxygen out of the room for a lot of our legislative initiatives that are hitting in 2024.
Yeah, Tim, I was so glad you mentioned the mental health piece because I know that was a big priority for the House. Didn't really go anywhere in the Senate because of, to your point, other things that took oxygen out of the room. So I think big things to watch for next year. Of course, we'll continue to kind of keep you posted, but there were a number of issues too. I know we're working on some stuff, in terms of freight and logistics, thinking about additional investments that need to be made. We worked on some housing bills last year with the Association of Realtors, the home builders, and we've kind of had a joint effort actually with the Georgia Municipal Association, Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, Realtors, home builders, and Habitat for Humanity, all to find some common ground on housing stuff. So we've got, I think, a bill that's active. It just kind of needs a conference committee report. So we're kind of talking through if we're going to your point, Tim, keep with that or change forms a little bit. But I know we'll also probably have some additional housing pieces. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that housing's an issue in Georgia, and specifically in Metro Atlanta. So we really need to think about some alternative solutions to drive up the inventory, because the lack of inventory is really squeezing people so that they don't feel like they can get out of their homes and make room for new families that want to get into new homes. So Georgia's part of that national trend, and so we'll continue to do that. But from a workforce perspective, that's another area that we're watching, especially as we're thinking about some of these major announcements around the state. You're thinking about Q cells up in Northwest Georgia, of course, Hyundai down in coastal areas. It's just a huge opportunity. And we know we're feeling the strain too in Metro Atlanta. All that good growth in those other parts of the state cause more growth in Metro Atlanta too. So it's all wonderful good news that we are thrilled about, but just causes us to need to work through some of those growing pains. So we are excited to kind of tackle those. But Tim, I think this is always that fun part of a session that we never know what we don't know. There are always unexpected things. And I think in an election year, that's most certainly true. People get really interesting ideas and think about how to deliver value to their constituents. I was curious if there's any kind of left field ideas you've heard so far or anything that you think could, come up. I feel like, to your point, so much of last year was like new leadership and they were kind of trying to get introduced to themselves, get their footing. And so generally, we would want this to kind of be a super productive year, but it's an election year. There are so many study committees, so there's the opportunity for so much to be done, but I think it's kind of a big question mark for everybody, which is, exciting.
Yeah, it definitely is exciting. The there's a couple of issues that I don't think anybody was anticipating maybe a month or so ago that have moved to the front. We kind of expected that certificate of need was going to come back, and that sort of ability to construct or move ambulatory and hospital facilities in around the state, particularly in our rural parts of our state, has been a big focus. But what we didn't expect is that would also be happening around the same time that Medicaid expansion was being mentioned, and I should probably like put quotes around that with Medicaid expansion. There are a number of different models for how states have rolled that out, particularly for states like Arkansas and Kentucky and some of these others where they have various types of versions of that. North Carolina, I think, even has a version of it. So there's different ways of thinking about that. It's not necessarily one size fits all. So it's encouraging that Georgia is thinking about this in combination with things like certificate of need, that there's a possibility that we might see some assistance for our hospitals that have been struggling with this for quite some time. So that is definitely one that is going to be super interesting. It'll also be it'll also be interesting to see what the school choice effort looks like, uh, and whether that is back to more of the education savings account side, or whether it's more of sort of a hardcore voucher style. Like, what is that going to look like? But it seems like that issue is not going to go away. So that's another one that's going to be interesting to watch happen, and particularly in an election year. And I don't want to bring up truck weights because it's not my area of expertise, but I have a feeling that that is going to come back, the weight that is allowed on our, our roadways. If those of you who didn't follow this last year, it was a very interesting thing to watch for those of us that don't have like a specific investment in this particular policy area. But it was an issue that took a lot of legislators' time, particularly the last week of session. And there's a conference committee. There's a whole lot of things happening around that took several days of time up at the session. It's a very contentious issues, particularly for some of our legislators that have a very vested interest in their local regions for seeing that pass or not pass.
A weighty issue, you mean?
Nice.
For the Pines on a Friday morning, had to do it. But yeah, I think those are all great things to mention. I think that we'll continue to kind of see where we all land. So much, I think too, the biennium, there's so much left over from last year. And so trying to figure out what does continue to move forward, it's going to be interesting.
And
But
Daniela, I like one of the things that I think is going to be interesting that we see that may, as we talk about oxygen, begin to take some oxygen, is tort reform. It's something that the Georgia Chamber has been a leader on. And when you talk about the things that our team in that specific area has been working on, premises liability is something that I think touches every single person who works anywhere, anybody who has an institution, anybody who has a large business or small business for that matter. We've heard the governor be very open that he plans on doing something. We know that he will have to obviously work that bill both through the House and the Senate, and we know we'll be supportive. We are just waiting to kind of see what his package looks like, as his he has a really smart team on it, the likes of David Dove. And when they release kind of what they want their package to look like, I know that we'll be in full support to ensure that we're protecting the business community throughout the state. The other piece that's really interesting that I think we'll get to see in really real time is the growth of the workforce sector around the growing EV industry. Hyundai moving down to my neck of the woods. We had a conversation with the chamber president down there, with some educational partners down there, and the way that they are going to have to grow kind of the base workforce to be ready to step into the tens of thousands of jobs that are being brought to that area will test not only that region and local community, but will also test our TCSG system to get quick start and get everyone ready to walk into those careers.
yeah, I think those are great points, Cosby. And certainly, if you'd like to learn more about lawsuit abuse, we'd love to talk to you. Tim probably has heard our spiel 12 times, but I would say to the point about it impacting small businesses, we've actually really seen that be more detrimental to small businesses because they don't always have all that extra insurance to cover the costs of lawsuits that can really damage community businesses. And so if you want to talk about lawsuit abuse, we are happy to and would do so all day. Tim, you have anything to add there?
Not on that issue. Luckily, it's one that I do not have to work on, but I do appreciate the information that you all provide on that one. I would like to touch briefly on another big one that's likely coming back. One piece of it that's a big interest for the Metro Chamber, and this is around betting and gambling. So for the Metro Chamber, we've been proponents and sponsors for the online mobile sports betting. So those of you who aren't aware, in almost every state, I can say that now, because it's gotten to such a tipping point. fans that are attending major sporting events are allowed to have betting via their phone. We could say internet, but it's really mobile. That just creates a different type of fan experience for those of you who are familiar with like DraftKings and kind of FanDuel and some of these sort of online uh, uh, betting apparatuses. We just don't have that opportunity here. We like to say that it still happens. There are ways that people find to do this, but yet Georgia receives none of the revenue. So where you can, literally drive across the state lines as close as North Carolina and have that happen as part of your experience, you cannot do that here. For Georgia, it would mean somewhere in the neighborhood of about $120 million in revenue just for the mobile sports betting piece. And that would go through the Lottery Corporation and would fund our pre-K and Hope scholarship programs and Hope grant programs. So there's some interesting alignment that might happen there with a refocus on pre-K and college completion, and the need to expand the reach of those programs and where is the funding going to come from. So we're hoping that this is the good year for it. And Nick Fernandez on our team has been working at this a long time with a lot of our partners, but not to be confused with the other pieces of gambling legislation. So there's what they call destination gambling. These would be more of your casino style that you're probably familiar with mostly in Vegas and other places, but that is not of interest for the Metro Chamber. I'm just going to lay that out there. We are very focused on the online mobile sports betting, but there is a whole other group that is focused on the place-based and on things like parimutuel or horse racing and all these other pieces of that. But we are encouraged around the online mobile sports betting. There seems to be this focus about we are missing the boat on the revenue and losing that opportunity every year. So it'd be great to see that finally get across the line this year.
Yeah, and generally the Georgia Chamber has been supportive if it does fund educational efforts, like pre-K, like, options to support Hope Scholarship or potentially a needs-based aid program. So that's kind of where we fall into. So a great point to mention and something that would certainly help the workforce community. We did get a question in the chat, and if you've got questions, please feel free to add them. I know Tim and Cosby are just really interesting to listen to, but we want to make sure we answer any questions so you're ready for session. But one about the expanding Georgia's workforce study committee that I had the opportunity to serve on. I'll put the recommendations in the chat just so y'all can see them. They're kind of divided by policy and then specific legislative pieces. I think that, when we talked with Chairman Albers about this, he, kind of shared that he thinks there'll be a number of pieces of legislation that do come out of this work. It was something that the lieutenant governor specifically wanted to make sure that he had as part of his workforce effort to make sure that the Senate is putting forth a lot of solutions that will benefit the business community as a whole. Workforce is continually the number one issue for our members, and I think certainly the lieutenant governor has heard that loud and clear. So we are expecting a number of pieces of legislation to come from this. I would say licensing has been a big piece and was something that we talked a good bit about in the study committee. One piece that's kind of gone through so far, I don't know if y'all seen this, but TCSG made an announcement right with the governor's office right before Thanksgiving about a statewide job board that would kind of help to centralize some of those things. Certainly want to make sure that people all across the state know those opportunities. And so we're continuing to have ongoing conversations about how the business community can get really involved, make sure that they're aware of the tool. How do we integrate our technical colleges, K-12, universities into all of that? Another area we focused a good bit about was making sure that people in communities know how their local workforces, kind of what their needs are, and how can they align K-12 programs as well as technical college programs with those needs. We often see some great CTAE programs in a high school, but they're not always linked to the local industry opportunities. Obviously, that's a great way to get kids on a good path and start to develop their careers. Certainly doesn't mean that's where they'll end up, but it's a great place to start. So that was a lot of the work that we focused on with that study committee to think about those solutions. But I'll put it in the chat. I know certainly Chairman Albers is very excited about everything that was included, and I think we'll have some good pieces of legislation. So certainly kind of the Senate is looking forward to make a big splash. But Tim, I know you presented too with y'all's new talent supply report. Anything else you or Cosby want to add about stuff y'all may have heard from members of the committee?
Um, no, but I was encouraged to see kind of the well-rounded um, outcome of that report. They could have kept a very narrow focus, and sort of zeroed in on maybe something like manufacturing or something. Like they really could have made this hyper specific if they wanted to, given the topics that they covered. But it was a pretty broad ranging report that they issued from that. It included, everything into like K-12 career counseling all the way through, workforce development and business investment. So it's a fascinating study on on what study committees can do when they really look at these issues broadly and try to think about impact. So that was encouraging. I was glad to see sort of the reach that Chairman Albers led that committee through.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we left a corner of the state unturned, which was great. We hit all the miles and all the fun spots to see, which was good. But certainly all good stuff. So Tim, I know we talked about, a lot of issues that necessarily aren't education. Transportation is probably going to be a big one. Are there any other things we just want to flag for folks kind of as we start to think about wrapping up of issues that, may kind of pop up and, again, kind of distract folks from some of the other workforce priorities that we seem to have really good consensus on from Republicans and Democrats and House and Senate leadership, and of course the governor's office as well.
Yeah, there's one that on its face doesn't seem like it affects K-12 until you realize sort of like the long tendrils of a particular policy. So that is around record restriction. Um, and what we've heard kind of after the fact from our K-12 folks particularly, but it also goes into pre-K and early ed, for any of our businesses or local education agencies or local school boards where they are hiring new staff that are going to interact in any way with kids and families, there's background checks that happen. And we know, I can talk ad nauseum about previous calls we've done around Georgia's criminal information system and the work that we've done to update that. But if you have an individual that has a charge that hit them, and not a conviction, but a charge that hit them, in some cases 15, 20 years ago, maybe when they were much, much younger, that charge can preclude them from having any type of job application be successful with these local boards and local institutions. And so there's a lot of work to be done around that. Our K-12 system has highlighted that. Our K-12 systems have highlighted that as one of the issues that they're struggling with. Just like everybody, they are attempting to navigate this very sticky talent problem that we're in. So they're thinking outside the box on hiring and maybe offering opportunities to populations that haven't had access to those jobs before. And that particular issue with the background check is tripping them up for a number of positions. So we'd like to see like the second chances and record restriction fixes go through this time. The occupational licensing is one that I'm really interested to see what that takes on. Would affect a lot of the folks on this call, but certainly affects a lot of our potential workforce, particularly those that are coming from other countries, other states, and are trying to get their licenses renewed here. And then are very confused about the rules. So the thing that I'm really interested in with that, and it probably has the most likely to pass, is that more transparency around what is required for the licenses, the dozens of licenses that the state is responsible for granting. So that I think is going to be interesting to watch. I do think that the certificate of need issue is going to eat up a lot of time, rightfully so. It's a big issue. It's a lot of money at stake. And it's a lot of healthcare for individuals and families that's at stake too, particularly for not just our rural areas, but particularly for rural areas. So I think that will take a lot of legislators' time. Um, I have one that's not really a legislative issue, but it's probably going to get talked about at the legislature because it's a big policy rollout. And that was the Georgia Match program that the governor rolled out at the Workforce Summit a few months ago. So if you're not familiar, this is a joint, I'll call it, effort from our 2 and 4 year institutions where students in their, correct me if I'm wrong, Danielle, but I believe it's their senior year, maybe junior and senior year, now that I think about it, that would get a notification letter in the mail from these various institutions to basically say, like, based upon your individual student record, you're already, like in the running for being accepted at these institutions, and that some of it is regional driven, and but if you can imagine, a student, when you get those acceptance letters, it's a big thing. Like, you watch that mailbox, like you're waiting for that one institution. Well, in this case, you're getting a letter that shows all the state institutions, the 2 and 4 year institutions that you're eligible for. So it could really change a student's outlook, or maybe a family's outlook, on what they think their post high school opportunities are. And there's also inclusion from the Georgia Student Finance Commission links around financial aid and what's available to the student, and how that system works. So I think it's a lot of people have interest in seeing how that rollout and how the acceptance works with our high school students, and if we actually able to make those stronger connections. We know how great our 2 and 4 year systems are, but there are certainly a lot of Georgians that just aren't aware that those options are available to them. So excited to see that program roll out, and hope it's very successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to mention, Tim. And I put the link in the chat if y'all are interested in going through and learning more about it. But I know Metro Atlanta Chamber and we at the Georgia Chamber worked really closely with the governor's office on the governor's workforce summit to roll all that out. And certainly really excited. I think what Tim mentioned too is that it actually will tell you, this school is 2 miles away from me. This is what your costs are going to be. So really walks kids through that. And I think Tim's point, it provides a path of saying you're already in. You just have to let us know that you want to go. So it's something that I think is going to be a big game changer. I know when we worked together through our Smart Decisions Coalition, found that information was often the biggest barrier to kids moving to the next stage of their journey. So super excited to see what this will do for students. And students got their letters in October of this year for next year. So we're continue. I think appropriations too. I think they were able to absorb things for this year and the student finance budget, but maybe in future years, maybe some resources there on a legislative side. But Tim, that was a great segue into thinking about, long-term projects that we all work on kind of throughout the year. We use session as our move through point on specific bills, but would love to know too, kind of how y'all are thinking about this session in terms of some of y'all's bigger, longer term priorities. And I'll put y'all's talent supply report in the chat just so people know about it. And I'll put, we released a workforce report in our fourth quarter, so I'll add those too, but would love your thoughts there.
Thanks, Danielle. I think I'm really curious to see, you mentioned housing earlier, and then we also have this discussion around tax credits and exemptions that's happening. So I think what I'm really interested to see is what that looks like both short and long term. None of these issues are siloed. Housing isn't separate from things like earned income, and it isn't separate from transportation. But I think that the state is getting smarter about how we realize the connective tissue for some of these things. A lot of it has happened right now, and it is happening right now in the economic development world for these particularly new projects. So when you have a company that lands in a small rural county that is like 50 to 100 jobs, that can be community changing for that local community. So we talk about ones like, whether it's Rivian or whether it's Hyundai, these are massive projects that absolutely have impact, but there are no less or more different than these smaller projects that land. So the state is thinking a little bit differently, not just on the incentive side, but realizing that all of these things are starting to connect, and to ignore any of them is to leave that community kind of out to the side and how they respond to those projects landing. So I like to say we're a victim of our own success. We've been really good at economic development and business development and expanding jobs and opportunities here, but with that comes a responsibility to make sure we're also paying attention to the other factors that get influenced by that. And it's not enough to leave it on local communities or local regions to do it all. We certainly can do a lot, but we can't do everything. And I think that is where the long-term look seems to be around economic development and things like housing and transportation and water and all of these other things that are all connected to these development projects.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, too, those talent pipelines are almost part of the infrastructure of a community too. It takes a long time for K-12 to work with the business community, to work with the technical college and universities to find all those streamlined things. And it takes time, but certainly as we continue to see the state grow, more investment and more jobs are going to come here. But we want to support, of course, our existing industries, making sure they've got the resources, and making sure that people understand those full opportunities. We don't want people underemployed when they could do more, and be more involved in their communities, better support their families, have all those opportunities that they're looking for. So I certainly agree. I know from our perspective, we're kind of looking at the talent piece from a preparedness issue. Do kids really have the skills to be successful in that next stage of their career journey? Participation, Georgia has a very low labor force participation rate, around 62%. So kind of by the way that this metric is defined, 40% of working age adults aren't engaged in the workforce currently. Of course, when we think about our workforce shortages, that 40% of folks would really help make a difference. So what barriers do we need to remove to get folks back into the workforce, so that they're able to make the most of their individual lives and for their families too? And then, of course, that demographic cliff. We are seeing such interesting places for employers. You've got 4-5 generations working in places, and how do you balance all of those needs, communication styles to still deliver a really effective product at the end of the day, which is what businesses do, is deliver a product or service. So it's definitely going to be super interesting. I would say that we certainly too, to your point, Tim, we've done so much work on taxes. I've learned more about Georgia's tax incentives than I ever hoped to. So it's been such a fun summer and fall. But absolutely, how those incentives are, utilized makes a huge difference in how our economy can grow. Georgia has a very poor legal climate, and so if we're able to improve that, what additional opportunities are going to come to the state, and for small businesses and large businesses that are being impacted to this, housing, transportation, all huge things. Our CEO says we've got 4 T's and 2 H's, and it's housing, healthcare, tax, tort, transportation, and talent. So I think any big issue you could want to focus on is probably going to be a focus of this session. So I don't think it'll be boring, which is, good. But Tim, any other thoughts too, as we start to wrap up?
Just one other kind of longer term focus for the state that I think is really worthy. The dual enrollment study committee had some initiatives, or had some call outs for the high demand career initiative, and maybe offering a path for some regionalism around that. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean. So we have a high demand career initiative list that derives a lot of well, it has a lot of program impact. Everything from our quick start and technical college hope grants and all of these other pieces, all the way down into high school, and our CTE programs. And there are a lot of pointers back to that high demand career list. But what we've realized, alludes a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, through our economic development success, that some of it is regional, where you have regions that have different needs than the region that's next to them from when it comes to job demand and future job demand. So the idea that we have one exhaustive list that applies to the entire state isn't really realistic. So I think you're seeing some moves from the governor and legislature, and our smart folks that are at Department of Ed and the CTE that are thinking about it a little bit differently and trying to think, how can we realign some of these incentives? Like, we're not talking wholesale change or anything like that. We're talking about just a refinement of how we prioritize those high demand careers, and that realizing that if you have Plant Vogel near Augusta, you're probably going to need a different type of support around high demand careers. And same thing for like Bainbridge or anywhere you are in the state, you're going to have a slightly different labor market and a slightly different talent need than other regions of the state. So it's important that the state think about that. There are certainly ones that apply statewide, and that is an absolute recognition, but the regional effort is really important, and particularly with this focus with Dr. Wall and the work that she does at DOE and rethinking prioritization around career and tech ed, and what importance that has for local communities. Like, I think all of that is aligning to a longer term strategy that's going to be really fascinating to be involved in and try to support as they refine that work and really hone it out. But I think for our workforce folks, it definitely has some impact if you're talking about shoring up support for these high demand programs and high demand areas of education in different parts of the state.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that those local and regional solutions are just so invaluable. And it really helps, I think the students, families, you get to see, really huge opportunities locally in your community, which are great places to start for students. I know we hear more from our members of them talking about career journeys for, new and future employees. And I think that's really what businesses are starting to shift of, is how do we get you in a good place? And then how do we continue to grow you, which is super exciting. Well, Tim, I'm so grateful. I know Cosby had to drop off, but Tim, appreciate everything that you do. One, for Max, and as an executive committee member, and then of course, the partnership between the Metro Atlanta Chamber and the Georgia Chamber. Certainly, if y'all got questions about anything we talked about or something we didn't talk about, and maybe you didn't want to ask everybody, please feel free to reach out to either of us or Joy. She knows everything. And so we want to continue to be a resource to y'all. I'll just share a couple of slides as we wrap up today. Again, if you're not a Max member, this is kind of a list of all the opportunities that do come with Max membership. You can join in January. Just start off the year fresh, get a full year of benefits. It's going to be great. It's all built around size of your organization and budget, so it's super customizable and really meets your needs as an organization, which is wonderful. So again, if you've got questions, there's Joy's email to get more information, or feel free to reach out to us as well. Again, thanks to our anchor investors that do such a good job of supporting Max and workforce development in Metro Atlanta. We really couldn't do it without the support of these organizations to our programming all year long. So thank these groups, work with these groups, and just continue to do all good things. But that's all I have today. I hope y'all have a great Friday, a wonderful holiday season full of all the good, fun things in the world. So Tim, thanks again, and thank you, Joy. Y'all have a wonderful week.